from the Liberal Democrats just for a moment, because the European Union has been struggling for months to agree on how to deal with the migrant crisis. It's seen over 500,000 asylum claims being made in Europe since simply the beginning of this year. Yesterday, EU interior ministers imposed a plan to relocate thousands of migrants across Europe. Now, Mr. Juncker, he's the president of the European Commission. He wants 120,000 refugees taken from Hungary, Greece and Italy. That's largely where they are at the moment, and relocated to other European countries. EU leaders meeting in Brussels today, they're expected to approve the plan that was approved by a majority, not a unanimity, but a majority of interior ministers who voted for it yesterday. But countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, they remain opposed to the scheme, with Romania, Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary voting against. Finland abstained. Other terms agreed as part of the Lisbon Treaty, which the UK has opted out of and won't be included in the quota system. So we're not part of this quota that is being agreed. Neither is Denmark. Instead, Mr. Cameron has committed Britain to taking 20,000 Syrian refugees directly from refugee camps still in the Middle East, around Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey. But that's 20,000 between now and 2020. In other words, over 5 years. And the first of these, we understand, probably only about 100 arrived yesterday. Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond says that the migration crisis plays directly into the issues Britain is raising as part of its renegotiation strategy by focusing attention on the problems of free movement. Several countries, including Austria, Slovakia, Denmark and Germany, have had to reimpose border controls in response to the huge influx of migrants. They say it's temporary. In his State of the Union address earlier this month, President Juncker praised freedom of movement as a unique symbol of European integration. And I'm joined now by our political correspondent, Ben Wright, who's in Brussels. Ben, it's good to see you. Tell me, how much bitterness, how divided are the countries over this quota plan? It got through, but there was quite vehement, I understand it, minority resistance.
Yeah, Andrew, there's great bitterness among many countries about how this has been imposed, and it would have been unimaginable just 2 or 3 weeks ago that they would have forced it through on a majority vote. But that's what they did. As you said, 4 Eastern European countries voted against it. Finland abstained, but it is now EU law, and countries like Slovakia, who do not want to be forced to take any of these migrants, are going to have to do that or face fines. They can't just opt out of this. So this is going to happen. It's left a lot of bitterness and resentment, but the fact that it did go to a majority vote shows the depth of the crisis now that is confronting European leaders.
And we now know, I understand, Ben, what the quotas will mean. Of the latest figures, I think it's Germany will be taking over 30,000, France around 20,000, down to the smaller countries. Is that right? The countries can now see how many they'll be expected to take of their quota.
That's right. There is a formula that is determined how many of these migrants each country should take. The Commission has published the exact figures, and that formula is worked out on the basis of a country's size, GDP, its population, and that's how they arrive at the numbers. What's less clear is exactly how all these migrants currently in Italy and Greece are actually physically going to be relocated. And as I said, even though Slovakia has been told that it has to take X number of migrants, they're not going to be forced to. They're not going to have buses driven up and migrants deposited in Slovakia, we don't think. But they could well be facing quite hefty fines if they don't step up to the plate on this one.
And of course, we're just at the beginning here, aren't we? Because there's a lot more migrants either already in Europe or on their way than the 120,000. This is going to continue, I would think, Ben, to be a running sore for the European Union.
Yeah, and this is the early stage. It's the early stage of a long-running problem it's going to have to grapple with now, but probably next summer as well. And the focus of today's meeting at the European Council, heads of government, will be about the broader strategy, how to, for instance, beef up border control and security and checks in Greece, how to do more to help the 4 million Syrian refugees currently in refugee camps in Lebanon, Turkey and Jordan. And I think that's where Britain, as you said, they have an opt-out from redistributing migrants already in the EU, but they're the biggest single European donor in terms of giving money to that region and those refugee camps. And I think that one of the things David Cameron will be saying today is, look, you've all got to be doing more on that front. We can't just spend our entire time fretting about what to do with the 400,000 migrants who've managed to make it to the European Union. This is a far bigger problem that we need to be doing more to tackle. The question, though, is how will David Cameron's pitch on those lines be absorbed here? I think there is a view that the fact that David Cameron and Britain have an opt-out, which they've chosen to exercise in terms of dealing with the problem within Europe, may cause Britain some difficulty on the wider question of renegotiation. It may sort of irritate some of the people he's trying to convince on the much broader renegotiation package. It was interesting. Philip Hammond, as you just said, was talking to some of us last night here in Brussels and said there is a view within the British government that, in fact, the two issues play into each other, the migrant crisis in Europe and some of the issues Britain is talking about in terms of possible restrictions to the freedom of people to move across the European Union, restricting benefits and all the rest of it. Ministers think that there is a bit of a convergence between the two agendas in Europe at the moment, but we'll see. I think there is certainly some annoyance that Britain is not pulling its weight and doing more to take its fair share of the people who are currently in the EU and looking for a home.
Yeah, I can't imagine that Mr. Hammond's words will have gone down that well in Brussels. Ben Wright, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for marking our card on that. We can now speak to the Conservative MEP, Daniel Hannan. He is still in Brussels. Daniel Hannan, even if there wasn't a European Union, if Europe as a continent faced this mass influx of migrants, wouldn't Europe have to divide these migrants up and take them in on some kind of quota basis?
No, I think that's actually causing rather than soothing the problem. There's a refugee crisis, as you were just saying, on the borders of Syria, in the frontline states and within Syria, where there are more than 7 million people displaced. There's a relatively small number of people, relative to the number displaced in Syria, who have already made the crossing to the EU, who are therefore relatively safe, in the sense that you're safer in Hungary or Italy or Greece than you are in Syria, and who have got there by paying people traffickers. Now, I think that it is immoral to allow people, as it were, to jump the queue when there are more needy people who haven't paid the people traffickers. And I also think it's ludicrous to pretend that you can have free movement of peoples and quotas for refugees. It's one or the other.
So you would leave these hundreds of thousands of migrants, refugees, some asylum seekers, some economic migrants, you would leave them to wallow in Greece, for example?
Well, I mean, first of all, I've actually got the figures here. 2/3 of them are not even claiming to be from Syria or Afghanistan, which are the countries which have the biggest numbers of refugees. So by that criterion alone, I would say these are not the people in the most need.
No, but they are now in Greece, for example. They are now in Greece, for example. It would be your idea of Greece being one of the poorest countries in the European Union. It's got massive problems of its own, even without this influx. Your idea of any kind of European fraternity would be just leave them there?
No, I think Europe should look at creating safe areas within Syria with a no-fly zone, and also within North Africa, decent, humane places from which people can lodge an asylum application without coming to the EU. In the meantime, I think we need to break the link between getting on some rickety dinghy into international waters and being allowed to stay in the EU. But I have to say, you know, from a British point of view, this is not what we signed up for. We opened our borders to the EU. It's now clear that the EU has opened its borders to the entire world. Now, that wasn't the deal.
Yes, but the problem has been that it's not been able to control its own borders. And it's all very well to talk about safe havens, but there are hundreds of thousands already in Greece and in Italy. Safe havens don't help them. And you would, Italy's not the most prosperous country in Europe either, particularly the south. And you would just leave them there. There would be no sense of helping our fellow European countries?
Well, I was just helping in the south of Italy. I was recently volunteering in a hostel for unaccompanied migrants in the south of Italy, people who'd crossed, in many cases, having been orphaned in the crossing. And like everyone else, I feel great sympathy, but that's not the same as saying that we can open our borders to anyone who is fleeing from poverty. Because if you do that, you are potentially inviting hundreds of millions, billions of people to settle here. I think we have to face the fact that Schengen has failed. As long as no country is in sovereign control of its own frontiers, you have the tragedy of the commons. The migration authorities of each state have a perverse incentive to wave people onto the next place so that they become another country's responsibility. And actually, until we restore borders in Europe, this problem is going, or this challenge is going to continue. Now, it doesn't have to be Britain's problem. We've opted out, as you say. We still have the option of imposing border controls. But frankly, now that we've seen the precedent being set of qualified majority voting in immigration policy, hands up any viewers who think that if we vote to remain in the EU, our opt-out is going to be respected in the long term.
Well, that we will see depending on how the referendum goes. Just finally, though, you mentioned creating safe havens in the Middle East for the refugees. Who would provide the military power to make them safe?
Well, I think it may be time to dust off the plan that Turkey was proposing some 18 months ago. They were offering to deploy significant ground troops to create a northern buffer zone. Obviously, they would want to do it as part of a NATO and regional coalition. I was someone who was very skeptical of any military intervention in Syria 2 years ago when the motion was defeated in the House of Commons, and as a result, the idea was dropped in Washington, D.C. as well. I think things have changed utterly since then. Islamic State barely existed in August 2013. We now have this organization that is kidnapping and murdering British subjects solely on the basis of their passports.
So you now want a European military force to go and create safe havens? Is that what Daniel Hannan is suggesting to our viewers?
No, as I just said, the people who have offered to provide the bulk of the ground troop are our NATO allies, Turkey. I think
but they wanted other people involved
in the region who have suffered much more than... Yes, and in practical terms, those other people will be the Anglosphere democracies, because we're the people who have the capacity to police a no-fly zone.
All right, Daniel Hannan, we'll have to leave it there. I thank you for joining us from Brussels.